Think about the last time you pulled a dollar bill out of your wallet. You probably didn't even look at it. You paid for your coffee, grabbed your change, and went on with your day. That's how normal paper money feels to all of us. But here's something that almost nobody talks about. How could the world's most powerful economy exist without paper money? It sounds impossible today. Yet for nearly 90 years after the United States became an independent country, there wasn't a single federally issued paper dollar in circulation. None. So what did people actually use? If you were a farmer trying to pay off a debt, what did you hand over? If you owned a small shop, how did customers pay you? If merchants were buying and selling goods every day, what counted as money? The answer is a lot stranger than most people imagine. Before the dollar bill ever existed, Americans paid with things that sound almost unbelievable today. Tobacco wasn't just a crop, it was money. Seashells became valuable enough to buy everyday goods. Foreign silver coins from Spain filled the gap when America couldn't create its own reliable currency. Then came several attempts to print paper money, and some of them ended in complete disaster. Entire fortunes disappeared. People lost everything they had saved. Trust collapsed faster than the value of the money itself. Those failures left such deep scars that America's founding fathers tried to build an entirely different financial system on they believed would protect future generations from ever experiencing the same nightmare again. But history had other plans. Eventually, a brutal civil war forced the government to make one of the biggest financial decisions in American history. That decision created the first successful federal paper currency, the greenback, and forever changed the meaning of the US dollar. This isn't just the story of paper money. It's the story of trust. It's about why people accept a simple piece of paper as something valuable, why that trust can disappear overnight, and how one nation spent centuries learning that lesson the hard way. By the end of this journey, you'll probably never look at a dollar bill the same way again. To understand why America eventually created paper money, we have to go all the way back to the early 1600s. Long before the Revolution. Long before the Constitution. Back when the first English settlers were just trying to survive in a new world. When they arrived in North America, they brought farming skills, tools, and big hopes. But they were missing something that every economy depends on: a reliable way to pay for things. Back in England, people used gold and silver coins every day. That's how business worked. But the British government had no interest in shipping large amounts of precious metal across the Atlantic to a handful of struggling colonies. Gold and silver were simply too valuable to send overseas. At the same time, Britain made another decision that would shape the colonies for generations. It refused to let them mint their own coins. That wasn't an accident. The British Crown believed that the right to create money belonged only to the government in London. If the colonies could make their own currency, they would gain more economic independence. And that was the last thing Britain wanted. So the colonies found themselves stuck in a difficult situation. People had land to buy, crops to sell, businesses to run, debts to pay. Every part of daily life depended on trade, but there was never enough money to keep things moving. Whatever gold and silver coins did make it to America rarely stayed there for long. Colonists used those coins to buy finished goods from Britain, and before long, the money flowed right back across the Atlantic. That left local communities with a serious shortage of cash. Imagine trying to run a business today without enough dollars in circulation. Customers want to buy, stores want to sell, workers expect to get paid, but there just isn't enough money changing hands. That's exactly what many early settlers faced. So, instead of waiting for Britain to solve the problem, they came up with their own solution. If they couldn't use money, they'd trade goods directly. A farmer might exchange corn for tools. A blacksmith could trade horseshoes for flour. A carpenter might repair a neighbor's home in return for livestock or supplies. It wasn't fast, it wasn't convenient, and it definitely wasn't perfect. Every trade depended on finding someone who wanted exactly what you had while also offering exactly what you needed. That sounds simple, but in real life, it was frustrating and time-consuming. Still, people had no choice. Without enough coins, and without permission to create their own money, barter became the foundation of everyday commerce in colonial America. It wasn't an efficient economy. It was an economy built on necessity. And before long, the colonists realized they needed something much better. Bartering kept the colonies alive for a while, but it was never a real solution. It was slow, inconvenient, and depended on finding the right person at exactly the right time. As the colonies grew, people realized they needed something everyone would recognize as valuable. So they did something surprisingly practical. They turned everyday goods into money. In Virginia, that money was tobacco. Today, we think of tobacco as just another crop. Back then, it was much more than that. It was one of the most valuable products the colonies could grow, and almost everyone wanted it. Before long, tobacco became the closest thing Virginia had to an official currency. People paid their taxes with it. They paid off debts with it. Workers could earn it instead of coins. Merchants accepted it for goods and services. For many families, tobacco wasn't just something they harvested every year. It was their savings account, their paycheck, and their spending money all rolled into one. At first, the system actually worked pretty well. Unlike bartering, tobacco had a value that most people agreed on. It made buying and selling much easier. But the more people relied on it, the more its weaknesses became impossible to ignore. Tobacco could spoil. It took up a lot of space. Moving large amounts from one place to another wasn't easy. And worst of all, its value changed all the time. If farmers produced an unusually large harvest, the market became flooded with tobacco. Suddenly, what had been worth a lot the year before might be worth only half as much. Overnight, people's savings could lose much of their value. To solve part of that problem, Virginia introduced tobacco warehouse receipts. Instead of carrying heavy bundles of dried tobacco everywhere, farmers stored their crops in government-approved warehouses. In return, they received paper receipts showing exactly how much tobacco they owned. Those receipts could then be traded just like the tobacco itself. Without realizing it, the colonies had taken an important step toward modern finance. People were beginning to trust a piece of paper that represented something valuable instead of carrying the product itself. Meanwhile, farther north, another unusual form of money appeared. It was called wampum. Wampum consisted of carefully crafted beads made from seashells by Native American communities. Long before Europeans arrived, these beads held deep cultural and spiritual meaning. They were used in ceremonies, diplomacy, and important agreements. European settlers saw something different. They noticed that native communities valued wampum, and they realized those beads could also be used in trade. Before long, some colonies accepted wampum as legal payment, and it circulated alongside other forms of money. For a while, it seemed like another smart solution, but it ran into the same problems as tobacco. As European tools made production faster, more beads entered the market. The supply kept growing, and the value started falling. Once people realized they could produce much more of it, trust began to fade. The colonies kept learning the same lesson over and over. Money only works when people believe it will hold its value. Whether it was tobacco or wampum, once the supply became unpredictable or too large, confidence disappeared. And when trust disappeared, the money stopped working. As tobacco and wampum started showing their limits, the colonies still had one big problem. People needed money they could actually trust. Something that held its value from one town to the next, and even across oceans. Ironically, that solution didn't come from Britain, it came from Spain. The Spanish dollar, often called the Piece of Eight, became the most trusted coin in colonial America. It was made from high-quality silver mined in Spain's colonies in Mexico and South America. More importantly, people knew exactly what they were getting. The coin had a consistent weight, its silver purity was reliable, and merchants around the world accepted it without much hesitation. At a time when local currencies could lose value overnight, that kind of trust was incredibly valuable. Soon, Spanish dollars were everywhere. Whether you were buying supplies in Boston, trading goods in Philadelphia, or closing a business deal in Charleston, chances are the payment was made with Spanish silver. In many ways, it became America's unofficial currency long before the United States had one of its own. One of the most interesting things about the Spanish dollar was how practical it was. There weren't enough small coins to make exact change, so people came up with a simple solution. They literally cut the silver coin into smaller pieces. The Spanish dollar was worth 8 reales, so it could be divided into halves, quarters, or eighths, depending on how much someone needed to pay. Those small pieces became known as bits. That's actually where the old American expression 2 bits comes from. It originally meant 1/4 of a Spanish dollar. Even after the coin disappeared, the phrase stayed in everyday language for generations. The more people used Spanish dollars, the more they trusted them. They weren't backed by promises. They weren't tied to a harvest. They didn't depend on how many shells someone could produce. Their value came from the silver itself, and that made them far more stable than anything the colonies had used before. By the time the American Revolution ended, the Spanish dollar had become so deeply woven into everyday life that the Founding Fathers didn't try to invent a completely new monetary system from scratch. Instead, they looked at what already worked. When Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1792 and officially created the U.S. dollar, they modeled it directly after the Spanish dollar. The size, the silver content, and even the overall concept were heavily influenced by the coin Americans had trusted for decades. In fact, Spanish dollars remained legal tender in the United States until 1857, long after the Constitution was adopted. That says a lot. America eventually created its own dollar. But the country's first real lesson about stable money came from a foreign coin. And that lesson was simple. People don't trust money because of its name. They trust it because they believe its value will still be there tomorrow. For years, the colonies relied on tobacco, wampum, and Spanish silver to keep business moving. None of those systems were perfect, but they worked well enough to get by. Then something happened that changed everything. In 1690, Massachusetts found itself in a serious financial crisis. The colony had just sent soldiers to fight in a military campaign against the French in Canada. The mission failed, and when the troops returned home, they expected to be paid. There was just one problem. The government didn't have the money. There wasn't enough gold. There wasn't enough silver, and raising taxes would take far too long. Meanwhile, hundreds of armed soldiers were waiting for their pay. The colony had to make a decision, and it was one nobody in the Western world had really tried before. Instead of paying soldiers with coins, Massachusetts printed pieces of paper called bills of credit. Think of them as government IOUs. The colony promised that these paper notes would be accepted later for taxes and other public payments. In other words, people were being asked to trust that the paper would eventually be worth what the government said it was worth. Surprisingly, it worked. At least in the beginning, people accepted the notes. Businesses started using them. Trade became easier because paper was much lighter than bags of silver coins and far easier to carry from one place to another. For a moment, it looked like the colonies had finally solved their money problem. Other colonies noticed. If Massachusetts could print paper money, why couldn't they? Before long, colony after colony began creating its own paper currency. During the early 1700s, nearly every British colony in North America printed some version of paper money. But there was one major flaw. Nobody was working together. Each colony designed its own bills. Each colony printed different amounts. Each colony decided its own value. And each colony expected everyone else to trust its promises. That created a confusing mess. A bill that was accepted without question in Massachusetts might be worth much less in Pennsylvania. A merchant in Virginia might refuse a note that someone in Connecticut considered perfectly good money. Imagine traveling across the country today, only to discover that the cash in your wallet loses value every time you cross a state line. That's basically what colonial merchants dealt with. Things became even worse when some colonial governments realized how easy it was to solve financial problems with a printing press. Instead of controlling the supply, they simply printed more money whenever they ran short. At first, that seemed like an easy fix. But printing more paper didn't create more real wealth. It only created more paper chasing the same goods. Prices started rising, confidence started falling. The more notes that entered circulation, the less each one was worth. People began questioning whether those promises printed on paper meant anything at all. What started as a clever emergency solution slowly turned into a growing problem. The colonies had discovered something that governments around the world would keep learning for centuries. Printing money is easy. Keeping people confident in that money is the hard part. And before long, America was about to learn just how devastating the loss of that confidence could become. Then came the American Revolution. Winning independence wasn't just a military challenge. It was a financial one, too. Wars cost an incredible amount of money. Soldiers had to be paid. Weapons had to be bought. Food, uniforms, horses, ammunition, everything required cash. But the Continental Congress had one huge problem. It had no power to collect taxes. That meant there was almost no steady income coming in. Borrowing money wasn't much easier either. Few people wanted to lend large amounts to a group of colonies fighting the most powerful empire on Earth. So Congress turned to the only option it had left. It started printing money. In 1775, the government introduced a new paper currency called the Continental Dollar. On paper, the plan sounded reasonable. The notes would eventually be backed by future tax revenue once the war was over. People were asked to trust that one day they could exchange those bills for real value. The problem was that one day kept getting pushed farther away. The war dragged on. Expenses kept growing. Congress needed more money. So it printed more, and then even more. The states made things worse. Some printed their own paper money at the same time. Others failed to collect enough taxes to support the system. Before long, far more paper money was circulating than the economy could possibly support. The result was exactly what you'd expect. Prices exploded. Inflation spread through the colonies. A few dollars that once bought useful supplies suddenly couldn't buy much at all. Families watched their savings lose value almost overnight. Soldiers who risked their lives for independence were paid with money that seemed to shrink in value every month. People became frustrated, then angry, then they simply stopped believing in the currency. By 1781, the Continental Dollar had become almost worthless. Compared to silver, its value had collapsed to roughly 1,000 to 1. Imagine working for years, saving every paycheck, only to discover that the money in your pocket is barely worth the paper it's printed on. That's exactly what happened to thousands of ordinary Americans, farmers, shopkeepers, workers, even the soldiers who fought for freedom. Many of them carried stacks of paper that nobody wanted anymore. The collapse became so famous that it created a saying Americans repeated for generations: "Not worth a continental." If someone said that about something, they meant it had absolutely no value. That phrase wasn't just an insult, it was a reminder of one of the biggest financial disasters in early American history. But the real damage wasn't measured only in dollars. It was measured in trust. People no longer believed government promises. They no longer believed that simply printing money could create real wealth. They had watched an entire currency collapse right in front of them, and they weren't eager to let it happen again. That painful lesson stayed with the generation that built the United States. When the Founding Fathers gathered a few years later to write the Constitution, the failure of the continental dollar was still fresh in their minds, and they were determined to build a monetary system that would never repeat the same mistake. The collapse of the continental dollar left a mark that people didn't forget. It wasn't just an economic disaster, it became a warning. The men who helped build the United States had watched inflation wipe out savings. They had seen paper money lose almost all of its value. They had lived through the frustration of promises that couldn't be kept. When they met to write the Constitution in 1787, one thing was clear: they didn't want America to repeat that mistake. That's why the Constitution gave the federal government the power to create and regulate money. At the same time, it took that power away from the individual states. States were no longer allowed to issue their own money or make their own paper currency legal tender. The founders believed that if every state controlled its own money, the country would fall right back into the same confusion it had just escaped. America needed one financial system, not 13 different ones. But creating a stable currency required more than writing rules on paper. The country needed real coins. So in 1792, Congress passed one of the most important financial laws in American history, the Coinage Act of 1792. That law officially created the United States Mint in Philadelphia, giving the young nation its own place to produce coins for the very first time. It was a major turning point. For the first time, America wasn't relying entirely on foreign coins or temporary solutions. It was building a national monetary system that belonged to the United States. Interestingly, the new American dollar wasn't invented out of thin air. The government looked at the currency people already trusted the most, the Spanish dollar. For decades, Americans had used Spanish silver coins in everyday life. They were familiar, reliable, and accepted almost everywhere. Instead of asking people to trust something completely new, Congress modeled the U.S. dollar closely after the Spanish dollar's size and silver value. That decision made the transition much easier. The founders also wanted the new currency to have real value, not just a government promise. So they based the system on gold and silver. Coins were minted with carefully measured amounts of precious metal. A dollar wasn't valuable because someone printed the number 1 on it. It was valuable because it actually contained silver. Gold coins followed the same principle. Alexander Hamilton strongly supported this approach. He believed that if every coin held a specific amount of gold or silver, people would trust American money at home and around the world. And trust was exactly what the country needed after the disaster of the continental dollar. The government even created harsh penalties for anyone who tried to cheat the system. Changing the metal content of U.S. coins wasn't treated as a simple crime. It was considered an attack on the nation's financial foundation. For a while, this new system brought much-needed stability. People finally had a national currency backed by something they could physically hold. But another problem was already beginning to appear. America was growing much faster than its supply of gold and silver. More people meant more businesses, more farms, more factories, more trade. Soon, the country discovered that even a well-designed coin system had limits. There simply weren't enough gold and silver coins to support a rapidly expanding economy. And once again, America found itself searching for another solution. The new coin system helped, but it didn't solve everything. America was growing fast. New towns appeared almost every year. Farms expanded west, businesses opened, trade increased. People needed more money to keep the economy moving. The problem was simple. There just wasn't enough gold and silver. The U.S. Mint couldn't produce coins fast enough. Even worse, many gold and silver coins disappeared almost as soon as they entered circulation. Some were shipped overseas. Others were melted down because the metal itself was worth more than the face value of the coin. Before long, America faced another cash shortage. Once again, the private sector stepped in. Instead of waiting for the federal government, state-chartered banks began printing their own paper money. At first, the idea seemed reasonable. A bank would promise that every paper note could be exchanged for gold or silver stored in its vault. As long as people trusted the bank, the paper had value. And for a while, the system worked. Then the number of banks exploded. By the early 1800s, there were dozens. Soon there were hundreds. Every bank designed its own bills. Every bank chose its own artwork. Every bank printed different denominations. And every bank depended on one thing, above all else, its reputation. That meant a $20 note from one bank might be accepted without question, while a $20 note from another bank could be worth much less. The farther you traveled from the bank that issued the note, the less people trusted it. Imagine driving across the country today and discovering that the $100 bill in your wallet loses value every time you enter a different state. It sounds ridiculous. But that's exactly how the system worked. Merchants couldn't simply glance at a bill and know what it was worth. Instead, they carried a small book called the Banknote Reporter. It became one of the most important business tools in America. Inside were long lists of banks from across the country. The book told merchants whether a bank was still operating, how much its notes were worth, and whether counterfeit versions were already circulating. Before accepting payment, a shop owner might stop, flip through a few pages, and check whether the note in front of them was genuine. Think about that for a second. Buying something wasn't just about counting money. It meant checking whether the money itself could even be trusted. And then there was the counterfeit problem. It was everywhere. With hundreds of different banknotes in circulation, counterfeiters had an easy job. Most people had never seen bills from distant banks, so fake notes often looked convincing enough. Some historians estimate that nearly 1 out of every 3 paper bills circulating during parts of this era was counterfeit. That's an astonishing number. Imagine if every third bill in your wallet today might be fake. You'd question every payment you received. You'd hesitate before accepting cash from anyone. That's exactly what happened. The financial system became slower, riskier, and far less predictable. People weren't just trying to earn money anymore. They were constantly trying to figure out whether the money they already had was real. America had escaped one monetary crisis, only to drift into another. The country finally had plenty of paper money. The problem was that nobody could be completely sure which paper was actually worth something. By the 1830s, America's money system was already messy. Hundreds of private banks were printing their own notes, and people were constantly wondering which ones they could actually trust. Then things took another dramatic turn. At the center of it all was President Andrew Jackson. Jackson had never trusted banks. Years earlier, he had accepted paper banknotes as payment for land he sold. When those banks failed, the notes became worthless, and he nearly lost everything. That experience stayed with him for the rest of his life. To Jackson, real money wasn't paper. Real money was gold and silver you could actually hold in your hand. So when it came time to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, Jackson refused. He believed the bank had become too powerful. In his eyes, it gave too much control to wealthy bankers and financial elites while ordinary Americans paid the price. His veto succeeded. The bank's charter expired in 1836, and with that, America lost the closest thing it had to a central bank. At first, many people celebrated. They believed removing the bank would create more freedom and more opportunity. Instead, it opened the door to one of the most chaotic periods in American financial history. Without a central bank overseeing the system, many states passed free banking laws. On paper, the idea sounded simple. If you met certain basic requirements, you could open a bank. And once your bank opened, you could issue your own paper money. Suddenly, new banks appeared everywhere. Some were honest businesses trying to serve their communities. Others existed for one reason, only to make easy money before disappearing. This became known as the Wildcat Banking Era. The name itself tells you something. Many of these banks were built in remote places, so far from major towns that people joked the only visitors were wildcats roaming the countryside. Whether every story was true or not, the message was clear. The farther a bank was from its customers, the harder it was for people to show up and demand the gold or silver that supposedly backed its notes. That gave dishonest bankers plenty of room to cheat. Some printed huge stacks of impressive-looking banknotes without holding enough gold to redeem them. Others created the illusion of wealth by showing inspectors barrels that appeared full of coins but actually contained scrap metal hidden beneath a thin layer of gold. As long as people believed the banks were financially sound, the scam continued. But trust doesn't last forever. Eventually, rumors spread. Customers rushed to exchange their notes for real gold or silver. Many banks couldn't pay. One after another, they collapsed. When a bank failed, its paper money became almost worthless overnight. There was no federal insurance, no government bailout, no safety net. If your life savings were tied to one of those banks, they disappeared with it. Imagine spending years building a business or working your farm, only to wake up one morning and discover that every dollar you've earned is now just colored paper. That wasn't a rare tragedy. It happened again and again. Financial panics in 1837 and 1857 made the situation even worse. Businesses closed, families lost their savings, and confidence in the banking system dropped even further. America had learned another painful lesson. A currency is only as strong as the institution standing behind it. When that institution disappears, the paper in your pocket can lose its value faster than anyone ever expects. And once again, the country found itself searching for a better answer. By the early 1860s, America had already tried almost every kind of money imaginable: tobacco, seashells, foreign silver coins, colonial paper money, private banknotes. Some worked for a while, others ended in disaster, but none of them gave the country a stable nationwide currency that everyone could trust. Then the Civil War began. Everything changed overnight. The war wasn't just the bloodiest conflict in American history. It was also one of the biggest financial emergencies the country had ever faced. The federal government suddenly had to raise enormous amounts of money. Armies had to be recruited. Soldiers had to be paid. Weapons, food, uniforms, horses, railroad every single part of the war effort cost money. And not just a little. The old system simply couldn't keep up. At first, Congress tried a temporary solution. In 1861, it authorized the Treasury to issue demand notes. These were paper bills that people could exchange for gold or silver whenever they wanted. On paper, that sounded reassuring, but reality was very different. As the war continued, more and more people showed up expecting to redeem those notes for precious metals. The Treasury didn't have enough gold and silver to meet the demand. By the end of 1861, redemption had to be suspended. The system was already breaking down. The government needed a completely different approach. So in February 1862, Congress passed one of the most important financial laws in American history, the Legal Tender Act. For the first time ever, the federal government issued paper money that didn't promise immediate redemption in gold or silver. Instead, these notes carried something much simpler: the full faith and credit of the United States government. That was the promise. Nothing more. These new bills became known as greenbacks, thanks to the green ink printed on the back. Before long, they began circulating across the country, helping the government finance a war that otherwise might have been impossible to sustain. Of course, not everyone welcomed them. Many Americans remembered the collapse of the continental dollar. They asked the same question their parents and grandparents had asked decades earlier: is this just another paper currency that's going to become worthless? It was a fair concern. And in the beginning, those fears weren't entirely wrong. As more greenbacks entered circulation, their value dropped compared to gold. Prices rose, inflation spread. A greenback dollar eventually bought much less than a gold dollar. Workers felt it. Families felt it. Even soldiers fighting on the front lines watched the purchasing power of their pay shrink as the war dragged on. But this time, something was different. Unlike the Continental Congress during the Revolution, the federal government now had stronger institutions behind it. It could collect taxes. It could issue government bonds. It had a growing economy to support its financial system. That made all the difference. Then came another major reform. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a new system of nationally chartered banks. Instead of hundreds of unrelated banks printing completely different notes, these new banks issued standardized currency backed by U.S. government bonds. A few years later, the federal government placed a heavy tax on state bank notes, making it almost impossible for private state banks to keep printing their own money. Slowly, the confusion disappeared. For the first time in American history, the country was moving toward a single, unified national currency. It had taken decades of failures, financial disasters, and one devastating civil war to get there. But America had finally built a monetary system that could begin earning the trust its people had been searching for all along. By the time the Civil War ended, America had finally reached a turning point. The country had spent more than 2 centuries experimenting with money. It tried bartering. It used tobacco. It traded seashells. It depended on Spanish silver. It watched paper money collapse. It survived private banks printing thousands of different notes. Every system solved one problem but created another. Then came the greenback. It wasn't perfect. Its value dropped during the war. Inflation hurt families, businesses, and soldiers alike. Many people questioned whether paper money could ever be trusted after everything America had already been through. But unlike earlier attempts, the greenback didn't disappear. It survived. And that changed everything. For the first time, Americans saw that paper money could actually work, not because it was backed by gold sitting in a vault, but because it was backed by a government strong enough to stand behind its promise. That idea completely changed the future of American money. The greenback became the foundation for the modern dollar. Over the years, the financial system continued to evolve. There were still heated debates about gold, silver, inflation, and government spending. Those arguments lasted for generations, and in many ways, they still continue today. Eventually, the United States moved away from relying entirely on gold to support its currency. The final link between the dollar and gold ended in 1971. Since then, the value of the US dollar hasn't depended on the amount of precious metal locked inside a vault. Instead, it depends on something far less visible: trust. Trust that the government will honor its obligations. Trust that businesses will accept the dollar tomorrow, just as they do today. Trust that millions of people around the world will continue using it for trade, investment, and savings. When you really think about it, that's remarkable. A modern dollar bill is just paper. The numbers in your bank account are simply digital records on a screen. Neither has value because of the material they're made from. They have value because billions of people believe they do. That belief is what keeps the entire system working. When trust grows stronger, a currency becomes stronger. When trust begins to disappear, history shows that even the most familiar money can lose its value surprisingly fast. That's why the story of American money isn't really about paper, coins, or gold. It's about confidence. It's about whether people believe the promise behind the currency. The dollar you carry today is the direct descendant of those Civil War greenbacks. It carries the lessons learned from every success, every failure, every financial panic, and every painful mistake that came before it. So the next time you pull a dollar bill out of your wallet, remember this: you're not just holding a piece of paper. You're holding the result of centuries of trial and error, hard-earned lessons, and one simple idea that has shaped every successful currency in history. In the end, money is only as strong as the trust people place in it. When you step back and look at this whole journey, you realize something surprising. This story was never just about money. It was about trust. For more than 2 centuries, America kept searching for the right answer. People tried using tobacco as money. For a while it worked. Then it failed. They turned to wampum, believing it could solve the problem. It didn't. They printed the Continental Dollar, hoping it would finance a revolution. Instead, it became one of the biggest financial disasters in American history. Then came hundreds of private banks, each printing its own notes. Some were honest, many weren't. Families lost their savings almost overnight when those banks collapsed. Time after time, the same lesson repeated itself. Money doesn't fail because it's made of paper. It fails when people stop believing in it. That may be the most important lesson in this entire story. The greenback wasn't perfect. It lost value during the Civil War, and many Americans questioned whether it would survive. But unlike every failed currency before it, the greenback had something they didn't. It had a government with the power to collect taxes, support the economy, and stand behind its promise. That changed everything. For the first time, trust wasn't built only on gold or silver. It was built on institutions strong enough to keep their word. And that's the foundation the modern US dollar still stands on today. The dollar in your wallet isn't valuable because it's made from special paper. The numbers in your bank account aren't valuable because they're stored inside a computer. They have value because millions of people believe they'll still have value tomorrow. That's what keeps an economy moving. That's what allows strangers to do business every single day. And that's what history has taught us, again and again. Every successful currency is built on confidence. Every failed currency lost that confidence first. So, the next time you hold a dollar bill, remember that you're holding much more than money. You're holding the result of centuries of trial and error, painful mistakes, hard-earned lessons, and one simple truth that has never changed. A nation's currency is never just paper or metal. Its real value comes from the trust of the people who stand behind it. And once that trust is lost, no amount of ink, paper, or gold can easily bring it back.